Mass anti-government protests continue in Iraq with no end in sight. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Embattled Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul-Mahdi has called for an end to anti-government protests that he says have cost the country billions of dollars. More than 250 people have been killed since mass demonstrations began in early October. Thousands more have been injured. Demonstrators are demanding economic and political reforms. Over the weekend, at least 3 protesters were killed during an attack on the Iranian consulate in the Shia holy city of Karbala. Both Iran and the United States are seen by protesters as having way too much influence on Iraq's political elite at the expense of the people. There's a lot to talk about. Let's go straight to our panel. Daniel Serwer is the Director of American Foreign Policy and Conflict Management at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies right here in Washington, D.C. Namo Abdulla is a correspondent in the Washington Bureau Chief for Rudaw Media Network. Raed Jarrar is an Arab-American political advocate and blogger. And joining us from Baghdad is Mazin Al-Eshaiker. He served as a special advisor to the Prime Minister and currently heads the Injah Development Center and Economic Policy Center based in Iraq. And since you're in Iraq, there in Baghdad, why don't we begin with you? The protests now in their second month, the demonstrators basically demanding economic and political reform. One of the interesting features, if you look at the World Bank, despite the country's vast oil wealth, and we're looking at the #2 producer in OPEC, I think 5 million barrels a day, you're looking at Iraq's 40 million population. So many of them living on less than $6 a day. Talk to us about, you're there in Baghdad. What's the situation like there? Describe for us the feelings of these people that are taking to the streets.
Well, thanks for the invite, Mike. Let's start economically. I call Iraq as a rich country and poor Iraqis. The wealth of the country is not shared equally by everyone. There is a small 5%. Basically, the ruling parties controlled pretty much everything: the banks, the satellite TVs, all the other foreign agencies, land, and so on, the hotels, and so on. So the vast majority of the people are no longer middle class. They are basically in the poverty line. What started with this, it started out as a demonstration, later on became riots, and today I call it an uprising. And I'm very sad to report that today, so far, 18 people were killed also. So the number has risen to over 308 casualties since October 1st. I can go on, go into how the whole thing started. It started back last year when we had the election, and so the election law was written in a way that only favors the elite political parties. And the commission, the Electoral Commission, was handpicked from the parties themselves. So pretty much the people said, okay, so there's no point even participating. Less than 20% of the population participated in the election. So as a result, most people, 80% plus, realized that there is no legitimacy in this parliament, and whoever they ended up picking, which was obviously Abdul-Mahdi, he claimed to be an independent technocrat. He turned out to be very political and siding with the political groups against the people. When the demonstrations first started, their demand was simply jobs. And he just said, well, I'm going to give you 100,000 jobs. People realized this wasn't real. It's just, rhetoric. And so they upped their demand. And now they're demanding full political reform. Not only reform, just basically getting rid of this whole political class and replacing it with real democracy, multi-district elections, and having no political parties involved, and having a revision of the Constitution in order to restart this whole democracy process from the start.
Well, Daniel, let me get your take on this. How do you view these protests?
Well, I think they're genuine popular protests focused initially on jobs and services, services meaning electricity, water, health, education, but they're turning quite political without, however, a political leadership, which means there's a quandary. Say they're successful, the prime minister resigns. Who comes to power who in any way represents these protesters? It's hard to know who that would be.
And Namo, let me ask you, because I know that you've said that this is really a failure of democracy there, and pretty much that's what Mazin's saying as well. Why is that?
Well, if you look at what's been happening in Iraq since 2003, it's been 15 years. We've had several elections. The leaders have changed, different faces, but something has remained constant. And that constant is that the lives of average Iraqis haven't changed. They remain poor. Some people say, okay, Iraq has had like wars against ISIS. But before the war against ISIS, unemployment rate was at 8%, according to the World Bank that you just quoted, that report. 22% of the population now live under the poverty line, 1 in 5 Iraqis. So, so the argument that these protesters or these protests are driven by like Iran, the United States, or other countries, to me is really ludicrous. This is just the failure of the Iraqi leadership, as I think, this is an example of what many scholars call democracy without Democrats. You have regular elections, free and fair to a good degree, but the leaders are not real Democrats. They are either incompetent or utterly corrupt.
Raed, I want to give you a chance to talk about this as well, but perhaps also you can kind of amplify on what Daniel talked about, because I think it's interesting. I remember talking to someone in Beirut while the Arab Spring was underway, and they were talking about what was going on in Egypt, and he said, what we're seeing here is we're seeing people with the capacity to go out and demonstrate. What you're not seeing is demonstrable leadership, somebody who can move in once the vacuum is formed. And what Daniel's talking about is really key, isn't it? Because if you don't have a leader and it's leaderless, what happens next?
I mean, I don't think all revolutions in the world had like a well-formed political structures while it was going on. People who take to the streets to revolt against corrupt governments do not necessarily go in with a clear political agenda. And I think, like we saw that happening in other Arab countries where there were revolutions that brought down a regime, and there were post-revolution elections that some politicians and political parties tried to step in to fill the vacuum. So the two things are not really mutually exclusive, and they don't necessarily overlap. Like what we're seeing in Iraq now is the rise of an unprecedented new class of Iraqis, very young Iraqis, who came to age after 2003. And that is the class that is confusing politicians in Iraq, because the political messaging since 2003 has been reliant on contrasting what this government can provide as opposed to Saddam. And they use Saddam as a point of reference all the time. There was a dictatorship, Saddam did this, Saddam did that. Well, these kids never lived under Saddam. These kids grew up under this regime, and they are fed up with living in a country that is ruled by sectarian forces, that is ruled by extreme corruption, and I think most importantly at this stage, a country that is ruled based on foreign interventions. And these foreign interventions come from Iran mainly, from the US, from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, from other countries. But Iraqis are very, very sick of this entire system. So it's not an issue of, tweaking like someone's salary or having a few more jobs, or it really goes way deeper. Like people are talking about the constitution. They're talking about sectarian quotas in the governance system, where the president has to be Sunni and or like a Kurd, and the prime minister is Shia, and like these quotas. I think this new generation of Iraqis are fed up with that.
Well, the quotas that you're referring to, and Mazin, maybe we can talk about this as well, because in Lebanon, you saw a similar situation where sectarian, it was kind of divvied up. And also, what's happened in Lebanon, we're also seeing it in Iraq. The sectarian divides aren't as important as the income inequality, which has really become the major issue. So talk to me about that, and also to Raed's point, revolution. Are these people going to be satisfied with evolution, where you see incremental changes, or do they want revolution?
Well, what's going on right now is the government is literally begging those demonstrators for evolution, and they're saying, no way, You know, they've been offering them jobs, and then actually it's the laughter of all the demonstrators. The prime minister offered them something like $100 per demonstrator to go home, and they said, we want to sell our whole country for $100? You know, that was such a ridiculous offer. People were just laughing at it. Yes, he's trying to evolve into a more democratic government. When he took office last year, he promised the exact thing that the demonstrators are asking for. He promised a non-sectarian government, no allocation system, and he did exactly that. And he actually handpicked one, and actually he didn't even handpick the ministers. He let the political parties handpick and order him to appoint this person as the Minister of Interior, appoint this minister as the Minister of Transport. So he was just like let's call it the umbrella over all the ministers, and which was divided up by the different parties. So he did exactly what the people were asking. So that's why after a year of his rule, they're just fed up. They just don't want to take any more promises. Abdul-Mahdi was promising the demonstrators. He didn't deliver. Maliki before him had a lot of promises. He didn't deliver either. So they said 16 years is enough is enough. And as one of your guests was saying, this is the generation, the post-2003 generation. Although people who are anti-demonstrators are saying, yeah, the Ba'ath regime wants to come back. It's those Ba'athis. Well, these kids are 16 years old, 17 years old. They don't even know what the Ba'ath regime is. So obviously, they are worried that you know, somebody is behind them. And they talk about Israel and the United States and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm a demonstrator myself, I make it a point that I attend at least 1 hour a day. These kids truly, you know, their eyes are full of tears when they see the Iraqi flag, when they hear the national anthem. They all stand up and, you know, put their hands on they are truly patriotic. It's a generation that I've never seen in Iraq, and I'm very, very happy to see that there is the rise of this new popular nationalism who say Iraq first, and none to those Shiite, Sunni, Kurdish, Assyrian, Turkoman, whatever sectarian divide there is. They say we are Iraqis first and foremost, and we want to see our country be run as the neighborhood, as Turkey is being run, as Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Even, you know, poor Jordan is living a higher standard of living than Iraqis, with, like you said, 5 million barrels of day exported a day.
Mazin, you say you're out there viewing this in person. Talk to me about the evolution. How has it changed over the time that you've been going out there? I mean, is it more rage building?
Well, there are bits and pieces. Something like 200,000 people show up at Tahrir Square every night, and I do that at night also. We've been hit with tear gas. I had tears all over. I slipped and fell. We have to run. These kids have, the more they hit them with tear gas, the more determination they have. And as you probably know, they took over this 9-floor building called the Turkish Restaurant Building, and it's like their bastion. From there, they have those the green laser lights that they point at the army. And what is interesting enough is that the army is on the demonstrator side, because Prime Minister Abdul-Mahdi does not trust his army anymore. He only trusts the special forces that protect him. So army are, they've been stripped from their weapons, and they're walking in the demonstrator side. So he lost the students, he lost the labor union, he lost the lawyers union, the school union, the army. So pretty much the entire country is against Abdul-Mahdi and the few political parties that support him.
You know, we're talking about the outside influences, these other countries being involved. Reuters reporting that Iran stepped in to prevent the ouster of Mahdi. Of course, the Prime Minister had offered to resign. Here's how the Iraqi President Barham Saleh explained it.
I confirm that, as President of the Republic, I'll agree to hold new elections under a new electoral law and a new election commission. The Prime Minister previously agreed to submit his resignation if the blocs agree on an acceptable replacement, in order to adhere to constitutional and legal frameworks that will avoid any constitutional vacuum.
Daniel, if he leaves, what difference does it make, or does it make a difference?
I'm not sure it will make a difference, and I'm not sure that just his leaving will satisfy the protesters. President Barham Saleh is clearly trying to offer that up as a prize to the demonstrators, but The fact of the matter is that doesn't change the system, and his replacement is likely to be somebody who is named by one of the political parties that the demonstrators lack confidence in. So I'm not sure that replacement is going to work. I'm not even sure that new elections will work. It seems to me that there are a range of possible outcomes here, one of which is continuing instability, maybe worsening instability, another of which is a big change in the system somehow, and a third of which, I'm afraid, is a change that's extra-constitutional, that is a coup or something of that sort, that happened in Egypt when the protests against President Morsi reached a certain level, and the army stepped in and has now created a regime much more repressive than the previous regime that the demonstrators in the Arab Spring brought down. I think there's a wide range of outcomes possible here.
I want to get your thoughts as well, Namo.
I mean, I would totally agree with Daniel that even elections won't bring about radical change based on what we've had so far. I mean, we've had several elections. We had Maliki, we had what's his name? Abadi. Now we have Abdul-Mahdi.
Abadi.
To be honest, Abdul-Mahdi is probably better than all of his predecessors, in the sense at least he has not actively sought to deepen sectarian and ethnic tensions with the Kurds. And so here is what I think could probably work, is what the Kurds actually want. Not just because I'm Kurdish, of course, I may be biased, but look, in the KRG, of course, we have corruption in the Kurdistan Regional Government in north of Iraq. But the corruption we have is really a lot less than what you have in the rest of Iraq. And at least we know who to blame for the corruption. We blame the Kurdish leadership. We don't blame the Iraqi Arab leadership. So in Iraq, you have people vote on sectarian and ethnic lines. Kurds always vote for Kurdish leaders. Shias almost always vote for Shias leaders, and Sunnis vote for Sunni leaders. Why shouldn't we have an entirely decentralized government where we know who to blame? Now, nobody knows who to blame in Iraq. What's going to happen if Abdul-Mahdi is removed from power? Another leader, different face, but life remains the same for Iraqis.
And in his case, he was a compromise candidate people could agree on. He already kind of, in a way, compromised taking over that position. Raed, your thoughts, and to the Kurdistan Democratic Party President Masoud Barzani said that the protests are because of poor governance and ignoring the Iraqi constitution. Is he right?
I disagree on the point about further dividing Iraq along sectarian lines, because that is the line, that is the path that Iraq was on since 2003. It's a path of divisions and creating structures based on people's sects rather than people's location in the country.
We can have provincial federalism, Basra, a federal state based on geography. It doesn't matter. As long as we have a decentralized government where we have accountable leadership, that's, I think, what's going to work. Imagine the United States with all the 50 states, all were run by President Donald Trump's words, and the states didn't have local authorities to run their own daily affairs. It just makes sense. Yeah, if
but also
at the provincial level things are run, which are domestic, not at the federal level.
But also imagine a United States where Americans were told to move to states based on their race and ethnicity and religion. Like imagine if imagine if in the U.S. we had states that were exclusively for African Americans or for Jewish Americans or for Hispanic Americans. So I think that the different vision in Iraq is that Iraq is, I don't think there is any pushback against the idea of self-governance or decentralization, as long as these ideas are not based on sectarianism. Because building a system where we tell people to live in ethnic and sectarian enclaves is something that has been tried. Millions of Iraqis have been displaced over the last 16 years to create this new reality, and it has failed miserably. So I think where we live now, we are at a moment where Iraqis are revolting against ideas of sectarianism. One of the loudest chants in Tahrir Square in the last couple weeks has been a chant against sectarianism, a chant that says, we are all Iraqis, whether we are Sunnis or Shia. So there is this demand to move direction, more of a nationalist demand, a nationalist demand that rejects sectarianism and divisions internally, and rejects foreign intervention. Like that is the main streak that's going on. It's not a streak for additional divisions internally. It's not a streak for allowing the US or Iran or Saudi Arabia to have a larger role in the country. It's exactly the opposite. It's a streak of ending Iranian intervention and creating more unity internally.
Can I make one short point?
Yes.
Even though, like what Raed is saying, that sectarianism, ethno-sectarianism is bad, definitely it's not preferable. But to be honest, what you see in Baghdad now, these protesters, when it comes to the elections, those anti-sectarian, anti-ethno-sectarian protesters are a minority. You know why? Just look at the facts, look at the numbers. Almost all of the Shias vote for Shia parties. Why don't they vote for a Sunni leader? Because they don't trust a Sunni leader. Why don't the Sunnis vote for a Shia leader? Because they don't trust him. Why don't Kurds vote for an Arab leader? Because they don't trust Arabs. We have a bloody history of ethno-sectarian conflict that cannot be healed overnight. And I think the best solution is to divide the country, whether it's along ethno-sectarian lines or it's along geographic lines, it doesn't really matter. We need to divide the country.
Ryan, briefly, because I do want to get to Mazin.
Just like 20 seconds. Like I understand the specificity of Kurdistan in Iraq, and I don't think Iraqis oppose self-governance in Kurdistan. That has been going on for decades and decades and decades. But what we're talking about here is a different idea for governance internally. I disagree that Sunnis don't trust Shia and Shias don't trust Sunnis. That is, in reality, the last fair elections that happened in Iraq is when the elections when Al-Iraqiyya won. And the Iraqiyya won on a platform of non-sectarianism, where Sunnis and Shia voted together to secular political leaders. So I think the numbers prove the opposite. The numbers prove that.
But why didn't the leader of Iraqiyya become the prime minister? Because he didn't want enough votes. He didn't win enough votes.
Can I jump in here,
Well,
Mike?
Mazin, I do want you to jump in because you were on this broadcast in 2014, and you said you'd like to see a federalization of the entire country with 18 provinces, all with regional governance. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Basically the same as 50 U.S. states. So make your point, talk to us about that, and jump in and give us your take on what they're discussing here.
That's exactly what I said about, a couple of years ago or a year ago, that Iraq has to be decentralized, which is how the United Arab Emirates or Germany, Australia, there's a lot of countries that became successful economically because of decentralization. But going back to sectarianism, the cause and effect, it started out in 2003 with sectarianism. So the Sunnis were protecting Sunnis, Shias, Kurds and Kurds. Well, that developed into the allocation system. So now the Minister of Defense has to be Sunni, Minister of Interior has to be Shia, and so on. President, Prime Minister, and the Speaker of the House. Well, the effect of that is obviously corruption, because when you are for example, a Shia in a Shia ministry, then you're supposed to get as much money as possible for the Shias, but in fact, that money goes to his political party, not to the Shias themselves. There's an example I can bring up from just days ago. The vast majority of Iraqis in the province of Nainawa, which is a Sunni province, they all want General Abdul-Wahab al-Sa'adi, who is a Shia from the south. They want him to run the country because he liberated them from ISIS. And most of the people in Kurdistan would like to see Khalid al-Ubaidi, General Khalid al-Ubaidi, the former defense minister. So Kurds would like to see a Sunni. And in the other case, most people in the south of Iraq would like to see Barham Saleh run the government. So we're no longer talking about sectarianism. The country has moved beyond that. However, the politicians would like to stay with sectarianism because they have a reason to claim that we have to have a Sunni ministry, a Kurdish ministry, and so on, because that now, they gain a lot of money out of it. So now they would like to enlarge it. So now, when we talked about the military coup and everybody's afraid of a military coup, I'm always asking which military coup? Is it the Iraqi army's military coup or the PMU's military coup? The Popular Mobilization Units. So now we have two competing armies within Iraq. Each of them is competing to have a military coup. So it's getting a lot more complex. And most people talk about the replacement. And even Abdul-Mahdi himself said, I don't mind resigning if they find a replacement. You know, Iraq is up to 40 million people. I'm sure there are better people than Abdul-Mahdi. So he's not Superman that everybody's wondering, scratching their heads, wow, how can we replace Abdul-Mahdi? The reason he's saying that is because he can buy time. So he can let this, going back and forth between political parties about his replacement, and he can buy himself another 2, 3, or 4 weeks. But I can honestly inform you that all political parties know if they keep this haggling between them, the people will go from an uprising to a full revolution, and they might cross a bridge into the green zone, and it might be very, very bloody if they do that.
Daniel, President Barham Saleh was here in Washington at the end of September talking to the Council on Foreign Relations, and he said, is Iraq going to be condemned to a cycle of instability where regional actors fight their wars through proxies, basically pointing to Yemen and Syria? The United States there, Iran there, we've been discussing this. Where does all of that go? And the regional actors, I mean, they're kind of wedged in between a lot of neighbors who want to pull the strings in one direction or another.
Well, one of the odd things about Iraq is that Iranian and American interests have often coincided even when they had differences. And I think both the Americans and the Iranians at this point would prefer stability in Iraq to a collapsed state. There isn't necessarily, however, much they can do about it at this stage. The Americans are concerned mostly with the rebirth, regeneration of ISIS in Iraq. The Iranians are concerned with that as well, but they also want to maintain their political influence, as the Americans do. So there's a kind of tug of war going on that so far has been relatively peaceful between Iran and the United States inside Iraq. You can picture it getting much, much worse, like Syria, like Yemen. And I can't guarantee you that that won't happen. It seems to me that's the kind of concern that Barham Saleh definitely has, and he's anxious to prevent it as best he can.
Well, we'll leave it there. It's been as you know, a very complicated issue there, and it's not getting any better anytime soon, we don't think. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.